tool. And although the article was beautifully comprehensive, I'm going to take the prerogative of the podium, as they say at this time, to really focus on what I think are new paradigms in how we think of assessments and how we utilize them, and to focus in specific areas that I'm particularly I think are particularly important. So our learning objectives, and this is really to be derived as a consequence of reading the article and the listening to the presentation, is for the participants to be able to plan assessments to support and measure learning, to align assessments with objectives and content, to incorporate best practices in creating and delivering assessments, and to be able to review assessments and ensure effectiveness. So let's start talking a little bit about the definition and purpose of assessments. But before we get into that, I'd like to ask all of you to consider a question. And that is a very simple one. How do you use assessments in your teaching or your institution? If you can put those your thoughts in the chat, then the team, and Meredith in particular, will be accumulating those questions, and then we'll have a break in a little bit where we will address and share what other people are doing. So as we look at forms of assessments, I think the most important thing is that we understand that they really should include more than just evaluative exams. And as we've gone over in this series before, they are a valuable learning tool, not just a way to be evaluated. And we've listed here what I think are some of the key forward-looking concepts and how we start viewing assessments. And there are a number of attributes. You'll note that I omitted grades and ranking, and that's because I think many of us are moving beyond that. In the school I help run, we've gone to pass-fail grading, as many institutions have, and I think we are now talking more about providing feedback, establishing competency, and verifying mastery. Obviously, these things motivate students and reinforce learning. So looking at the cognitive foundations, formative assessments can be used to scaffold skills and improve metacognition as the students understand what they do and don't know. We know the power of spacing and the effectiveness of interleading to improve retention, and these can be leveraged as part of the assessment process. And lastly, feedback corrects misconceptions and reinforces correct answers. Insights from neuroscience. And to me, this was really almost game-changing to have an understanding at the neurobiologic and neurophysiologic level how neural pathways are solidified, not so much by the first pass of when you take in knowledge, but in the retrieval process, how as information is retrieved, you have increased myelination, better neuroreceptor transfer. This was covered beautifully by the series we did and the webinar with Barbara Oakley that you can refer back to, but it makes it directly relevant to those in the health sciences to think of these neural connections growing almost the way muscles develop with retrieval exercises. And this has really been described as test-enhanced learning. And test-enhanced learning is the idea that the efficacy of remembering concepts is augmented by the act of retrieval. And not only does this increase retention, but it improves understanding. So of the benefits of this test-enhanced learning one of the important attributes to remember is that this is effective across various learners and assessment types. Everybody benefits, the strong students, the weak students, those with more knowledge and those with less knowledge. It leads to improved metacognition, and it allows the students to reinforce specific areas, again, strengthening those neural connections. And as I've mentioned, there are ways to augment this test-enhanced learning, specifically spaced repetition, interleaving, where concepts that are related, it can be contrasted and compared and referred to at different times. And we all know the importance, I believe, of feedback, which leads then to better metacognition and learning outcomes and retention. So in the spirit of retrieval, just to give everyone a break and to get your brain cells working, if we can launch the poll and see how people answer this question. There we go. And these are easy, or should be pretty easy questions. And please pick what you think is the single, the best answer. And give it just another second. We don't have quite. Let's get 100 responses at least, please. If everybody get those brain cells working. And the vast majority, let's see, are we up? We're over 100. So I'm going to end the poll here and share the results. And indeed, that's right. It's effective across various learners. And I think that's really the important lesson to take away from this. And there's the correct answer. So practical implementations of TEL. Important to incorporate frequent quizzes, support retrieval at every opportunity. Have students generate summary points during or after class. Remember that the ability to summarize and again retrieve is a formative assessment exercise. It's important to explain this effect to increase student metacognition. Let them know why you're doing this. When I sort of tried to promote almost daily in-class quizzes, the students push back, but if they understand that this helps them learn, keep it, they're more accepting of it. Keep it low stakes, and then emphasize the importance of the learning objectives. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. I do want to bring up, and some of you may have had the pleasure of joining us last spring when we discussed Dr. James Folkstad from Colorado State, when he joined me to present his U-behavior system, which I was fascinated and continue to be fascinated by. And I just wanted to bring it up to remind people of it, and there's a reference in the article to this. But this was a learning and teaching method that used platform-based delivery and tracking of quizzes to promote optimal student behaviors and practices. And the important thing about U-behavior is they initially tried to share with students the importance of spacing and interleaving, and despite telling the students that this would improve their long-term retention, very few students actually used it until, and this is the key part of the U-behavior system, they then added grading incentives that through the platform tracked whether the students were taking their quizzes using and leveraging spacing and interleaving, and rewarded them for that behavior. And most insightful is that after the course, I believe it was a couple months later, they retested the students, and the students that had indeed incorporated spacing and interleaving had more retained knowledge. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that's really our goal, isn't it? To achieve durable learning, so that when students are faced with their boards, or in my mind, more importantly, faced with a difficult clinical decision, they know the content and can respond and make decisions appropriately. So I wanted to bring this up. The article, the appropriate articles are cited in our article on assessments. And please keep this in mind, that if you can incent the students to this behavior, it is more effective. I wanted to share with you now that although we've not instituted the U behavior system, in that it requires sort of a separate set of software that we don't have at Ames, but there are many ways to do this. You don't have to institute that model per se. And we did something that I consider very simple, and that I believe is equally effective in different ways. We had a traditional midterm and final exam as part of our curricular structure, and we eliminated the midterm and final and converted them into 3 cumulative interval tests. We have an 11-week term, so these tests are at weeks 4, 8, and then week 11 is a final, and actually the final is slightly more important from a summative, from a grade perspective, but the 3 of them are really 3 components, so they get to revisit the material 3 times. In addition, we have 10 weekly non-cumulative but serially summative quizzes, and this again allows them to repeatedly visit material and have multiple lower stakes exams. We also instituted a modular mastery-based system with differential progression, so that students could progress at different rates. It does add some complexity because every student gets pretty much a customized exam, but I'll address a little bit how we approach that using platforms and technology. And that's really been our approach to applying learning science to the assessment process. So I'd like to pause now and hopefully, Meredith, have we had some interesting ideas from the participants addressing how some of our participants use assessments in hopefully non-traditional ways? Meredith, would you like to take the lead?
Yeah, so we had some great responses from the participants. And of course, people are using assessments traditionally. So we're measuring outcomes, we're using them for midterms and finals, we're determining competence. So I think we're all familiar with those. We also had a lot of participants mention formative and summative assessments, which is great. So we see people using those formative assessments and not just the summative assessments. We also see people measuring progress, which would be similar usually to the formative assessments. So that's good that we're using some of the other uses as well. 3 of the comments that I thought were interesting that I thought you might want to respond to, of course, we kind of have to guess, but Dr. Agami, I'm sorry if I say her name wrong, mentioned that they use the assessments to improve the student experience. Dr. Amadou incorporates scaffolding and assessments, and Dr. Johnson uses it to calibrate the content. That's very similar to what we're talking about here. I wasn't sure if you wanted to address any of those. We didn't specifically address those, or I can if you want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And all 3 excellent comments, and all very much in line with this concept that try and move away from the feared summative test, that simply creates a grade or a rank, and that the end result is just to to either pass the course or excel in the course, but that assessments, this really is a learning tool, and hopefully the students will come away, will establish a methodology to keep learning through self-imposed retrieval, if you would, the rest of their lives. As those of us, that are in the practice of medicine understand clearly, examinations don't stop when you finish medical school. They don't stop when you finish your training. In most countries, and certainly in the US, you have a never-ending cycle, and it's also a very effective way to learn. So thank you for those. And Meredith, absolutely, if you want to elaborate further, please go ahead.
Okay, so the ones that I mentioned, so improving the student experience, of course, we're guessing at your attention to this, but you can use assessments as feedback on your teaching as well. So what is working, what isn't working, and you can make those adjustments based on what is happening with the students, because of course, in the end, you want them to be successful, competent healthcare professionals. That's our goal. Incorporating scaffolding. So this ties into, so scaffolding is where you build skills to reach a goal. So a lot of you mentioned the formative assessments. You're probably doing that as part of, you're probably scaffolding those skills. So that I just wanted to mention that because that was kind of a different term that other people hadn't used. Absolutely, we can use those formative assessments to scaffold the skills, to build them up to the bigger goals and outcomes that we want for the course. And then calibrate content also kind of ties into that feedback. We don't just use assessments to determine if the students have learned, but we can also use it to adjust our instruction. When things aren't working, we need to adjust our instruction to make sure that the students do learn the things that they need to learn and get those competencies. So I thought those were great comments, lots of great comments. We got so many, we can't go through all of them.
Yeah, no, that's really is excellent. And we'll move on. And we decided to have sort of a question and answer period at intervals in the talk, one just to get feedback as it came to mind. So there'll be an additional time for other questions. I do want to say that I'm going to talk specifically about how assessments can be used and to help the teachers prepare for an upcoming class. And this is, to me, one of the exciting parts of what technology has to offer. And so to that end, let me move ahead and cover some of the basics in terms of designing assessments. Again, this is all beautifully covered in the article. But just to quickly review, formative versus summative assessments. That typically formative are low stakes evaluations, and they should be leveraged to augment long-term retention and improve metacognition. Summative traditionally are higher stakes, but as I've said, encourage everybody to increasingly use serial low stakes assessments, which still account, which still make up the grade, but is done in, it discourages cramming, it discourages anxiety, and it reinforces learning. It's very important when designing summative assessments, however, that are going to count towards competency and mastery, that you use a selection of assessment instruments which are valid and reliable. And this is addressed in the article as well. So just a brief recap: well-designed assessments will support the learning process, aid in decision-making. Poorly designed assessments don't gauge student learning, and very importantly, create frustration for both students and faculty alike. Students saying, well, how can you test me on something that I didn't know I needed to know? And then I'll talk about that in a minute. So in terms of planning assessments, it involves determining the need for instruction and analyzing both the learners and the context for learning. So it's important to know who your learners are and what the context is, to analyze the instructional needs, design and develop your objectives, assessments and instructional strategies, and then assess the evidence, evaluate the instruction. This is alluded to in one of the comments that was just made, that you can use this as a tool to improve your teaching. So alignment of assessments, absolutely crucial and not always easy. You want to align the learning objectives, instructional strategies, and assessments to make sure that all of these three components, sometimes called the golden triangle, are all in alignment. So I want to jump now to actually, those of you who know me, one of my favorite subjects, and that is how to apply technology to make what we do as teachers and to help our students, because I really think that this is the future. And it will never replace what we do, but I think it can augment what we do. And I want to use some examples directly out of the AIMS instance of the Lecturio platform that we use, but these are just screenshots and show you some of the things in the broad context of assessments and aligning in these concepts we're talking about, what this can look like and how it can improve what we do on a regular basis. So this is just a screenshot of one of the Lecturio videos. And as you can see, the learning objectives from these short video lessons are listed, and I've blown them up, and there is a larger rendition in the right lower side of your screen. But this assures that you have learning objectives that are synchronized with the material. And then at the end of each of these video lessons, that you can then have specific questions that induce retrieval of the material and test comprehension of the key learning objectives. And to make it even more powerful, then once these are answered, they can be put into a spaced repetition. And this is how we augment retrieval and further build on this concept of assessment as a learning tool. And then lastly, you get a pop-up summary note. And you say, well, how is this an assessment? But it really is a formative assessment. Again, it compels the students to retrieve what they believe they've just learned and make a note of their understanding that they can then refine. So multiple ways to use retrieval in an organized fashion. And this alludes to one of the comments from the discussion we just had. You can actually, when you have this based in a platform and delivered ahead of your class time, you can actually then look at data and start to understand what questions students are struggling with and come to class pre-informed with an idea of, boy, the students weren't getting X, Y, Z. I'm going to spend my class time on that, which really front loads this whole concept, not so much that you hold a class, share content, then test on it, and then have to revisit that. But this can all be done proactively. And the repetition that is built into this process allows them to learn it before class, to have the faculty reiterate it in class, and then the students can always revise after class. So the other key feature that I think makes platforms very powerful and has been a shortcoming of platforms in the past, many platforms that had content really were limited to your sharing the content that the platform was providing. And I'm very excited now that on the Lecturio platform have a modality called the learning path, which is something that each faculty member can customize. And it looks a little like this. There's an editor, and as you can see, you can break it down by weeks. You have your syllabus. And then in any given week, and this again is a screenshot right out of the one of the courses from Ames, but you can build in, you can include your learning objectives, associated video assignments, and QBank questions, or any other kinds of recall questions. And I think this is very powerful because I know that at Ames and in talking to many, many educators, we all know, and faculty have a good sense of just what they want to teach and how, but this allows these materials to be organized in advance and assigned and tracked. So I think this is really, opens up a whole new realm of possibilities in delivering material and helping students. And then there are many other ways that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, and so I'm not spending time on it, but how you can configure QBanks, you can administer and monitor exams, randomize questions, implement browser security, and then use data tracking and question performance. So these are, I think, the more conventional and standard tools that most platforms have, but I think the idea of being able to have your own content and draw from content libraries, add anything you want, and assure this proper alignment before the class is even taught or the courses are even taught, I think is very powerful. So I'd like to send another question out to our participants, and that is, what technologies do you employ, not particularly brands or names, but what types of technologies do you employ in delivering and tracking assessments? And I would include, I haven't touched on, but they're in-class technologies. We're using them right here and now, the chat, polling, etc. So please share your thoughts in that regard, and then we'll address those answers in a few minutes. So moving on to assessment types. Especially in the healthcare professions, there are really three predominant types, and of those, the multiple choice question, the first listed here, is probably by far the most dominant. It's been maligned. I think when used properly, it can be very effective, and it's probably the easiest way to allow technology to be a tool to aggregate results and create immediate reporting. Extended matching questions is when you can sort of mix and match and have multiple potential answers. And open-ended questions have been used for a long time, certainly in clinical scenarios. They're harder to evaluate, but as we all know, very important. So since the MCQ is perhaps the most widely used in the health professions, just wanted to bring up a few bullet points. They're more in the article. The STEM should fully formulate the problem or the question. The responses should all grammatically match the STEM. It's generally advised that the options of all of the above and none of the above should be avoided or used sparingly. Negative phrasing should be avoided. This is not trying to trick students or to fool them. You want to be straightforward, and thus negative phrasing really is not felt to contribute much and should be avoided. And avoid extreme statements such as always and never, because we know in life they rarely happen. So another retrieval exercise. Let's launch our poll again, and just have hopefully a very straightforward retrieval. What should be avoided when writing multiple choice questions? And this is just a little consolidation, a breather, and gets everybody retrieving. And wow, we have, I haven't put anybody to sleep yet, thankfully. Everybody's right on the mark. We have over 100, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And indeed, negative phrasing is what you want to avoid. And that is shown here. So I then wanted to touch on one last thing, and we're not, this is probably what I believe is many ways the most important task that lies ahead of all of us, and that is how do we measure and establish competency at the professional level, not at the knowledge acquisition level. And the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges in the U.S., has defined 13 key activities that they've termed entrustable professional activities. And there are also discussions about specific competencies. And I really wanted just to bring this up for awareness for every, just to share with everyone, because I don't think we should be giving talks on assessments and addressing this in healthcare professions without remembering that the goal is that our learners are competent, and more that they've gone beyond simply mastering knowledge, but they have competency in their professional activities. And part of developing these assessments, it's considered that assessments should be evaluated at every step of the process, that these assessments should embrace qualitative feedback and direct observation. I've alluded that there are 13 that have been defined. They're fairly encompassing, and that they're used to develop competency-based objectives and guide effective clinical assessments. And we're still working on how to evaluate this using technology, but there's a lot of discussion about that, and love to hear people's feedback, what you're doing. There are lots of conferences on this and a lot of attention being brought to it, but very important topic going forward. So to wrap up with a few recommendations that keep this very practical, I urge everybody to have an open mind and harness the power of technology. When I started at Ames about 4 years ago as the executive dean, we were still using paper and pencil for our tests, and though there was a lot of concern and pushback and hesitancy, we did convert to software-based technologies, and it was a huge benefit when the pandemic occurred, because we were already online in that regard. And as I've mentioned today, there are many benefits from it. In terms of the students, make sure you state your expectations clearly and comprehensively. One of the faculty, who's also a dean at Ames, has helped develop literally thousands of detailed learning objectives drawn directly out of reading assignments to help the students understand exactly what they should derive from their assigned reading. And as I've just shown, their learning objectives clearly stated in each of the video lessons in Lecturio. Very important concept. Ensure proper alignment and expectations of the learning objectives and assessments. We tell our students that, anything that's in the learning objectives is fair game for your assessments. It's not a matter of what's presented in class. We endeavor to make classes as much as possible retrieval exercises, and that helps them learn, but they can never be all encompassing. I encourage everyone to design and to space their tests for maximum effectiveness. We always try and use these evidence-based strategies from cognitive and neuroscience to augment learning, and test often and in multiple ways. That includes in class, out of class. We actually have a bi-weekly Jeopardy, for those of you who may be familiar with the TV series. It's the students can compete in retrieving knowledge or elements about various subjects. And it's designed to be a fun way to augment retrieval, but is yet another form of formative assessment. For the students, use the objectives to help you plan and prioritize your studying, and the implications on the faculty side is please make those as precise and actionable as possible. Help your students understand that they learn by retrieving, not nearly as much by listening, but it's all about retrieving, and that assessments should be your friend and not your foe. And that if they space out their learning, that's a key to long-term retention. I think, one of the greatest habits to change that many of us succumb to is this tendency to cram. This tendency to cram, and even though that is in the short term successful, or can be, it really does very little to contribute to long-term retention. So let's love to hear, Meredith. I'm going to turn this back over to you. See lots of things that have popped up in the chat, and any more things about use of technology or any other applications.
Yeah, we actually had great responses in the chat. It was a little hard to keep up. A lot of people use aspects of a typical learning management system, LMS. And of course, those are great to support learning because you can deliver assessments, you can automate them to provide feedback and scoring. And somebody even mentioned item analysis, which we discussed briefly in the article as well. So those are all great uses of technology. Some people mentioned some technology that kind of ties into gamification, like Kahoot and Padlet and simulation and polling. And those, of course, are great for classroom activities and formative feedback. So those kind of tie into some gamification, some student interaction, active learning. We had a bit of a healthy discussion. So you said you veered from the article and you presented mostly how we can use technology here and to do test enhanced learning. Some people were also asking about the role of multiple choice questions in medical education, which I know is you feel very passionately about, like what role that they can play and can they be effective? And also maybe as part of the bigger package of assessment, which if you haven't read the article, we did talk about that in the article. We talked about how students should be assessed in multiple ways. So I wasn't sure if you wanted to address that, because I know that's one of your passions.
Yeah, and it is, and I'm going to use the crutch or the lame excuse that I'm indelibly affected by my heart surgery career, where we're really compelled to be pragmatic, and we live in a real world, and when you look at different types of assessments, there's no question that if we could have a one-on-one, essentially an oral exam, and we do in our clinical settings, but when you're trying to help a lot of students and standardize and leverage the benefits of technology, multiple choice questions are by far, I think, the easiest to administer, to aggregate, to study. And I believe there is a lot of literature that has demonstrated that these can be and are very effective if used properly. If you have, the right construct. I've tried to mention some bullet points. Meredith, you in your article mentioned more, and also have citations, and encourage everyone to apply those. So I just think there's so much power and capability. For example, I just demoed this use of technology, and I did veer off because the article, because the article was so inclusive, and I wanted to get the conversation going and show sort of the real world that I live in applying this. So, all that being said, as we provide almost a customized exam per student to allow differential progression, it'd be very hard to do that without leveraging MCQs. So hopefully that sort of covers it in terms of addressing that. And in the clinical setting, we don't, yes, we use MCQs, boards use MCQs, but there are many other types of assessment as well. And our faculty actually can add to the grade just as a reflection of thoughtful discussion that happens in the classes. So it's not simply all arithmetic. We try and keep it objective to be standardized, but there is a component of subjectivity as well. Other questions, Rob?
Okay, so we also had some general questions. This one pertains to what you were talking about, your experience at Ames. In a pass-fail system, how do you incentivize students? And I think that's also a concern now that the step one, I believe, has gone to pass-fail. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and very much so. And there was a lot of discussion, are we going to, take this incentive away? So actually what we've done to be more accurate is we have pass fail, and then we also do allocate an honors grade for those that exemplify themselves. So there are 3 levels and we distinguish it. But what I tell the students as I welcome every incoming class, that to be a physician, you want to have a certain knowledge base that we try and determine, and it's not easy. What is a minimal knowledge base, and we leverage actually the National Board of Medical Examiners, the NBME international exam, the IFOM. It's the international version of the USMLE as an independent benchmark. And we set a passing grade based on international norms. So I think, that is really our approach, and we have those students that still do excel. They all want to pass their courses, and we try and set that bar as high as we can. I have one just is right in front of me that I thought I'd addressed. You have cheating when using online testing, and I follow this in I sort of in touch with many schools, and I always am bewildered as to why students, will game the system. And I marvel at how clever some of them can be. Fortunately, it's always a minority. And in our system, since they have to pass an external exam, there really is very little point to cheating. I don't know that there's any school that, I'd like to think that there'd be schools, where they don't have students that try and game the system. And to that end, a very practical solution to this, and what we are working on at Ames, is to have question banks that exceed the requisite number of questions in a given subject for a quiz, so that no 2 students get exactly the same quiz at any one time. And again, using technology, these can be randomized. So it becomes easier to avoid cheating. At our school, we also do proctor these exams, and we have very careful methodologies if they're remote, for example, during the pandemic, and now in that they're back in the class, we have actual proctoring. So hopefully that answers the cheating question, one of these days it may go away. I suspect it never will. Other questions, Meredith?
So we had some questions about formative assessments, and of course there's no, single answer to this, but some people asked, how do you incentivize students to use formative assessments that are not part of the grade? And if it contributes to the grade, does it still count as formative? And what percentage would you use as a low stake? So I'm not sure if you want to kind of maybe put those all together.
Yeah, and that'd be great. And I have to say, we're all figuring this out together, aren't we? I don't think there is an absolute answer, though. My understanding is, I think if it counts towards the grade, it fits in the, from an instructional design standpoint, you can tell me that I believe, that it's summative by definition. And if you have a lot of small summative things, they're described as serially summative. The formative is really to augment learning and to augment the metacognitive process. So I think it's pretty easy to differentiate the two, but very much have a strong bias towards low stakes and a serial summative approach, just based on learning science and evidence of how we learn. So can we call it summative formative? I've not heard of that. Meredith, what?
No, and I'm not that familiar with the serially summative that you talk about. I think some people consider, if they're very low stakes, that can still be considered formative. So like I said, there's no hard and fast rules here. I think this is still a subject of research of, what is the best route and what we should do.
And what I just to jump in, and maybe it's just the way I think, I'm less focused on what it's called, and more on what it does at the brain, how
Exactly.
it affects learning. And I try and, tell the students, it's not about your grade, it's what especially in the healthcare professions. I can't emphasize that enough. There's nothing more rewarding than to be confronted with a complex medical situation and you have everything at your fingertips, and tell your students, when they present that way to an attending or a senior resident, that will secure their pathway forward. It's really about durable learning.
Absolutely. I think that's the key part there. We asked somebody if you could expand a little bit about the EPAs and how they are, what the application is for health professionals education. I think you briefly mentioned it. We briefly mentioned it in the article. Would you like
Correct.
to expand on that?
Yeah, and I will briefly, but it's an all-encompassing. It really characterizes many of the major, or most, if not, perhaps I should correct myself and say all, though we don't say that, right? As with our questions, but should be a very inclusive list of what a physician should be able to do as they graduate from medical school and enter residency. And it's things like, provide a complete history and physical, and the like, alludes to interaction in teams and with patients. And rather, I think we could spend a whole hour, and many people, there are many seminars on that, and perhaps we will down the road. But the article that's in our article on assessments, we have a citation to the AAMC reference, and encourage everybody to pull that up as a guide. And I think the challenge going forward is, how do we standardize our approach to evaluating clinical competency? And we need to define clinical competency and then evaluate it. To me, this is a great project for instructional designers. Meredith, people just like you, to take something that is not clear cut and there isn't always consensus on, you may know a biochemical pathway or an anatomic structure, but these are much more broadly defined attributes that are still absolutely key to competency in the medical professions. Any other, let's see, we still have questions rolling in. And I do want to mention to everyone that we go through the chat and we'll try and pull out the key questions, the comments, and we'll provide a summary. And actually, as we're at the end of the hour, and we always commit and understand how valuable your time is to end on time, I'm actually going to maybe close the discussion here. Very brief summary. Assessments can augment and reinforce learning, not just measure it. Technology can be used to facilitate assessments and track student progress and performance, and that assessments include more than just the written exams. So this will be the follow-up. There'll be a handout that summarizes this. You have the article. Mention the follow-up. You can ask, there'll be a survey which should be launched in moments, and please fill it out. We really pay attention to it. I hope you like the presentation, and it allows us to continue on if we get positive responses. Once you fill out the survey, you'll be asked if you want a certificate of attendance. We will provide a summary document of key strategies, and all this should come out next week. You'll get the survey very shortly, though, so please fill it out. Our next and last event of the year, we thought it'd be fun to look at the year in review, all the elements, all the subjects that we've covered to date. We're going to try and make it highly interactive, and we're going to talk a little bit about our plans to continue this series into 2023. If you're interested in contributing to the learning science, we have part of our team responsibility is to facilitate ongoing institutional research. And here's a little plug for those of you who attended the webinar I did with Barbara Oakley. I've been working on creating a course on durable learning, which is actually situated in the Lecturio platform. And this series has an introduction by me and then a number of outstanding segments that Barbara Oakley put together. So, and you can have access to this through the Lecturio platform. I'm now going to, I think we can wrap it up. We're at the hour. As we all